What's up, guys? Today we're going to be talking about American Horror Stories episode 1 and 2 entitled Rubber Woman 1 and Rubber Woman 2. And I just have to tell you guys, we're going to be breaking down the plot beat by beat, spoiler by spoiler. So if you have not seen it, then please just click off this video, go watch the 2 episodes, come back, and we're going to discuss them. But I have some thoughts. First and foremost, we're going to get through the plot of the first 2 episodes pretty quickly. First and foremost, we're introduced to Scarlett and her 2 dads who are recently moving into Murder House. We get a lot of awesome scenes where we get to revisit the entire house and get a full sense of itself and its entire glory, while also calling back a couple of the things that we remember from the previous seasons. I have to say this off the bat, and I've said it in this channel before, I don't like the idea of constantly going back to Murder House. And the beginning of this episode really didn't install a whole lot of confidence in this episode or this series going back to it in the first place. We've been here before, we've seen this stuff, and it didn't have the balls to bring back anybody that we knew or really even cared about from the previous seasons. And I'm just going to have to throw that out there. I have my theories as to why, but that's going to have to wait until another video. Regardless, I feel like any delusion I had about this series or this episode, this story in particular, not really living up to the impact or, generally awesome moments that happened in the very first season of American Horror Story, those ideas were quickly put to rest when it became very clear that Scarlett was the woman in the rubber suit. She finds it, she loves it, she immediately puts it on, and she gets a sense of herself, or at least is starting to get a sense of herself, and that just kind of threw me off. I was thinking Ruby, that we were introduced to in the second episode, was going to be the woman in the rubber suit, and I feel like that's the way they were trying to sell it. But no, Scarlett is that person, and that is just part of her character. And I just have to say, from that moment on, I was completely into this particular character, and I felt like it's going to be one of the stronger characters that we've ever seen from this show because they don't have a whole lot of time to mess it up. I loved the idea of her talking about shame and not really talking about the things that she fears holding her back, but the idea that people are going to shame her for what she likes or what she does in a way that's going to make her a social outcast is a thing that's kind of stopping her from being what she wants to be. And how that discussion or that reality of her situation, it cuts both ways, not only in the fact that she herself is a lesbian, but also that she happens to be sexually attracted to kind of obscure concepts that most people might find offensive or overly disgusting. So if there's one thing I generally liked about these 2 episodes, it was Scarlett's character, especially within the first episode. Going through all the other story beats just so we can kind of get through this as quickly as possible because it is kind of late here when I'm recording this and trying to put it up. I have to say that I did not like the dad characters. Matt Bomer did a fantastic job. I don't know the name of the other guy off the top of my head, but every single time that they were on screen, I felt like the story was dragging, probably because the best part about it was Scarlett, her character development, and seeing just how dark this fantasy of hers is going to go, especially because she's in Murder House, a place that we know has the tendency to kind of bring out the most dark, depraved things in people who kind of let themselves go in there, as we saw with Tate back in Murder House. Anyway, as the story goes on in the very first episode, we have this back and forth flirtation between Scarlett and one of the rich, popular kids in her school about potentially hooking up at a slumber party that Scarlett ends up going to after she sneaks out of her house because she's grounded for looking at kind of hardcore, you know what I mean. Anyway, the slumber party ends up being somewhat of a trick where they've made Scarlett out herself to the entire school on a live stream. And so she goes home devastated, calls those girls and tells them that she's going to kill herself unless they go to her house and confront her. When they do show up, she dolls herself up in the rubber suit and ends up killing all 4 girls in the basement in somewhat of a similar fashion that we saw Tate deal with Violet's bullies back in Murder House. From there, we get somewhat of a glimpse of how much she's already bought into this entire concept of Murder House and the fact that she's surrounded by these ghosts and things that are ushering her in to become this monster that she's kind of wanting to be. And I have to say, for the very first part of this story, I was immediately hooked. It's a very interesting character in a place that we're very familiar with and something just a little bit different. I went into the second episode wanting so much more and for it to go so much darker, but I have my problems with episode 2. We're going to jump into the story about that in a second, but I do have a couple of things I need to say about the very first episode. One, I love that idea of the ending, and two, I hate the fact that everything that happened in this episode is something that we've kind of already seen before, especially when it comes to Murder House. The fact that we have a family moving in for, one specific reason. We have ghosts haunting people. We see everything that we've already seen before. And we also get a therapy session in the place where therapy sessions were held in the first season, right? I feel like that was in and of itself not enough to garner my interest. I wish that they had kind of shooken things up a little bit. Have the therapist go in the kitchen. That's all you had to do. I like the kitchen. I feel like most people would like that kitchen. It's a cool set, but maybe I'm getting a little too iffy about that. The other thing I did not like about this episode is I don't feel like it was well established that Scarlett and her dads were not moving across country or not moving to a very new place that she had no say in moving, right? Because she had the friend in high school that still went to her high school. And then by the time she puts on the rubber suit and throws it away, she's in high school with that same friend, but we're not entirely sure the moment that we see her that it's the person that she's been texting at the very beginning. I felt like I was only made aware of that during the second episode, and I can't be the only one who felt that way. With that said, we go into episode 2, where I think the biggest problems start to occur. Primarily the idea of a happy ending in Murder House. Been there, done that before, and I don't really need them to focus on it anymore. One of the things I was hoping for at the very end of the first episode was Scarlett was going to go down this really dark path that probably ended up with her killing her dads for one reason or another because they kept kind of pushing her. And then, being a mortal stuck in this house, or probably just being a mortal in this house that all the other ghosts are stuck with. And that they don't mess with her, but she doesn't want to kill herself, and she is just kind of there living her best life, torturing all these people. That's what I thought that they were going to get into with the second episode. And it kind of starts that way, where you have one of the nurses that was introduced, or probably supposed to be one of the nurses that was introduced in American Horror Story Murder House. And then you have Ruby introduced, which that's part of the problem with that. Ruby is kind of more of a badass ghost than Scarlett is. So she really just takes a lot of the thunder that I feel like they should have used for Scarlett during this episode. Like, they didn't want to make Scarlett too bad, or they didn't want to put her down that much of a rabbit hole, because you still need an ending. But from the moment that that's introduced in this love story that's kind of ham-fisted in there, I can't help but think that we've missed like 2 or 3 episodes in terms of American Horror Stories' usual pace for storylines, where ghosts and things would have been introduced, relationships would have been built, and this would have made sense in a different episode of a season and not just the second part of a 2-part story. And then you quickly go into this place where, well, Scarlett's not that bad. I mean, she's getting worse, but she's not that bad. And then Ruby is just out there killing everyone. I mean, she kills her dads, and that's... I feel like she doesn't get a lot of grief for that either. Like, Scarlett doesn't really care. And yeah, we deal with the idea that Scarlett is just this psychopath who doesn't really care, but she also has feelings for this girl, and that's not what real psychopaths are. And it just gets really muddied, in my opinion, and too much concessions for a happy ending when I don't think one was really needed. Anyway, focusing on the story at hand, one of the things I felt like they had to deal with if they were going to do a second part of this story, which I don't think they really needed to, just to put that out there, but you had to deal with the death of these 4 girls. And that's fine. I feel like they did that pretty well. They established it, and they put it right there in the very front of the story that the police are looking into this, and Scarlett is kind of at the top of their list. But I feel like doing that storyline and having to focus on the fact that these 4 girls just disappeared out of thin air, and the last place they were ever seen or located or known to be, or probably should have been, was Murder House. So obviously y'all killed them, is hurt by the fact that in the first episode, Tate or whoever else is in the rubber suit, which, there's the girl, there's Scarlett who's there, and then there's obviously a man because it looks like a man, it's not a woman, and they specifically say it's a man, so it's Tate or some other ghosts, which we are just not privy to in this entire 2-episode arc. But you have this rubber man or even Scarlett herself. I feel like that was a little bit muddied during the execution of killing the therapist. You have this person dying pretty much the same day the girls died, and she was there on a house call, which would be, figured out somewhere. She was going directly into another appointment that she presumably missed, and they're still seeing her as a therapist. I feel like that didn't play into the story at all, and it probably should have, because otherwise it doesn't make any sense, and it really muddies the water to really take me out of the story. That these girls are the priority, but not this therapist, right? Look for all 5. Like, why are 5 people missing? And the last time we ever saw them was in this house, or anybody ever knew they were at this house. They don't do that. And as the episode progresses, I feel like that concept happens again where, yes, because of the ending, all the bodies are found, but they have this contractor come in because they can't do the house the way that they want it to be this hotel or B&B or whatever it is, Airbnb. And they decide that getting a contractor to do it who needs a job or, is in financial despair right now, needs the publicity for it, is the best foot forward, at least for one of the husbands who's not going crazy over all the stuff in Murder House. And he decides that I'm going to hire this guy. I'm going to start an affair with this guy because apparently a lot of time skips are happening during all of this, and it's just not being talked about, or the story is moving way too fast to really deal with. And once the inevitable happens where they discover the bodies of the 4 girls that Scarlett put in the wall at the end of the very first episode, you're left with this problem where he instantly kills his handyman for having found it because the guy is way too good. He would have told the cops. And then because of the pace of the episode and the need to end it in the next couple of minutes after that point, the handyman and the contractor are both trying to help them cover up the bodies. Like, I made a list of everything you need. Like, that doesn't really make sense. Everyone gets over their death really quickly in this episode. And I feel like part of the fun of American Horror Story, especially in these places like Hotel and Murder House, is they don't realize they're dead. It's traumatic and whatnot, so you don't realize you're dead and you're not fighting it, but they're immediately okay with it. And honestly, all that stuff just started taking me out of this episode, not to mention the fact that we're rushing towards a happy ending that I don't feel like was totally earned, because Ruby was just this other creation that wasn't introduced or even alluded to in the very first episode. And I feel like there's stuff happening here that we aren't seeing, and we're never going to. So as good as the very first episode was, the second episode, while still entertaining, I feel like deflates it a little bit. And that's kind of sad, because if there's one thing I really want from this show specifically, is the fact that we're dealing with one episode at a time. We can allow ourselves to have a down, depressing, sad ending or something darker than what we usually get with American Horror Story. I feel like every single season of American Horror Story, you do all these really dark concepts, but because it has to be a long-form story and you have to build characters that you empathize with, you end up giving them a happy ending at the end. You've done it with pretty much every season so far, and I feel like we can get away from that. We can have something end with like, oh my gosh, like, oh man, like that's dark, and the implications for that are unknown. And I felt like we were getting to that with the first episode, and it was only going to continue in the second episode, but that wasn't the case. And I hope that every episode after this is one episode and has the gall to do something like that. End with everyone dying, or end with something being like kind of unleashed into the world that wouldn't otherwise be unleashed if not for the events of this particular story. To me, that's interesting, and it's really why I want this show to continue. As for my last couple of thoughts on these 2 particular episodes, they kind of butt heads with each other. I'm going to start with one that I feel like a lot of people can empathize with. This is Constance's house. I feel like continuously going back to Murder House only kind of highlights the fact that Jessica Lange is no longer within American Horror Story. They brought her back for Apocalypse, and even though that was a fantastic episode, in fact, it's probably the best in the entire season, you get the sense at the end of American Horror Story Apocalypse that, you know, they changed the timeline, so Constance probably doesn't die in the house. So maybe that's why she's not there. But Moira doesn't get her happy ending either, so why isn't she there immediately? And she's kind of the mainstay at the house. She's the person who introduces herself first. I'm the living maid and all that stuff pretty much every time, right? She doesn't hide herself, and we don't get any sense of any of the other people from any of the other seasons. I mean, I know you can't bring back certain people. You can't bring back Dylan McDermott, even though his character Ben is spoken about a lot, especially during the second episode. I'm confused as to why they didn't just bring him in for a cameo. And that goes to my later point, but let me just kind of finish this. The fact that it's Constance's house, it's her story in the very first season, no matter how much you're focusing on the Harmons, I feel like she's the only person who can kind of live in this house. And the fact that she's not there, and we continuously go back to it, especially with this, where she's not there and she's not even mentioned, is a disservice, and I feel like it's kind of doing more harm than good. That being said, I do understand why you would have the very first part of this story and this spinoff be in Murder House. It's instantly recognizable, the fans know it and love it, and it's somewhere that you can really tell a story that is self-contained like this. So I get that. I'm all for it, and I want them to go off and do something completely different with the remaining 6 episodes that they have, or 5 episodes. I know it's like split into 2. That's a discussion for another day. Anyway, here's my theory, and I'll probably make a brief video about this because I'm not going to elaborate, but here's my theory. This isn't American Horror Story. It doesn't take place in American Horror Stories universe. It is a movie that they're going to be playing in the movie theater, you know, the drive-in movie theater episode next week. At the very beginning, it's just going to be a movie within the American Horror Story universe where they're just kind of making up the rules, and that's why we don't see characters and hear about characters that we otherwise know. The reason they keep talking or alluding to Ben is because he was a notable therapist who died in that place. And that's why they didn't change up the iconography of the place. That's why they showed places and things happening in places that we knew of. And that's why they have a rubber suited man, but it's not Tate, even though it really should be. And everything that's inconsistent about this episode with the overall universe, it's not because they can't get people back. It's because it doesn't really take place in American Horror Story, because it's just a tale told within American Horror Stories universe. Just my theory. You know, tell me what you think about that in the comments. Hope everyone's having a fantastic day. I think it's a really good start for the show, and I cannot wait to see what they do in the future, especially as we get away from things that we already know. Anyway, hope everyone's having a fantastic day. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit that bell over by the subscriber button to notify you every single time I upload. It's been real.